Today on Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast, we're talking with Tad Homer-Dixon on climate change. Welcome to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Every week we talk to an expert who works on the frontier of global governance. And with me today is Thomas Homer-Dixon, the CIGI Chair of Global Systems at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Tad.
Great to be here.
Nice to have you here. Well, climate change, of course, is something we've all been hearing about for a very long time, and the question remains whether we're taking it seriously enough, partly because there are skeptics. What do you say to climate change skeptics?
The evidence is very clear. The scientific evidence is very clear. When you look at it in aggregate, add it all up and from the different disciplines and the different research programs, that warming is taking place, probably somewhere around 0.7 degrees, 0.8 degrees Celsius since the mid-19th century. And that, especially in the last 40 years, the warming is human-caused, and almost certainly by release of carbon dioxide in very large quantities. And that buildup of carbon dioxide is changing the characteristics of the atmosphere and trapping in more infrared radiation. Now, the science supporting those statements is pretty well indisputable at this point. You can get into arguments about whether the warming has been caused by sunspots, about whether carbon dioxide is actually the most potent greenhouse gas, whether it was warmer in the medieval warming period 1,000 years ago than it is right now. But those arguments, for the most part, just don't have any scientific support.
Is there any one particular skeptical argument that you would say is probably stronger on balance than the other ones? Is it the natural variability argument?
The issue that's really central for most climate scientists is what's called the sensitivity of the climate, how much warming you're going to get from a doubling of pre-industrial concentrations of carbon dioxide from somewhere around 280 parts per million by volume in the atmosphere to 560 ppm. In general, the sensitivity is assumed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 degrees Celsius. You double to 560, and that gives you, once the climate stabilizes, which may take several centuries, gives you a 3 degrees Celsius warming. That sensitivity is influenced by a lot of factors, and one of the critical things is clouds. How the clouds behave, what kinds of clouds you get, whether they're high in the atmosphere or lower in the atmosphere. And those affect the reflectivity of the atmosphere to incoming solar radiation, the sun's radiation. And there's been a lot of quite legitimate dispute about that. At one extreme, it's possible that clouds actually counteract warming by reflecting. As you get warming, you get more clouds because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that reflects radiation back out into space and so cools the planet to counteract the warming. Another extreme, the clouds can actually trap in infrared radiation and actually accentuate global warming. There's a paper that was released in Science magazine just a week ago that pretty decisively showed that on balance you're getting that reinforcing effect, what's called a positive feedback, and so you're actually getting more warming from clouds rather than less. So I think we're en route to settling that dispute, but that's the only one that I think really carries weight at this point.
Right. Now, we've been paying attention to the issue now for a couple of decades. Is it fair to say that we have global governance on climate change at all now, or is that still an aspiration?
It's largely aspirational. I mean, we have something that you might call a global conversation about climate change, and there's supposedly a United Nations framework in place, United Nations framework on Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol as part of the UNFCCC process. But overall it's rudimentary. There are very few countries that actually lived up to their terms, and if they have lived up to the terms of the agreement and the commitments they made, industrial countries for the most part, it's more or less by accident. Russia has, but that's because it had an economic collapse, and so its carbon dioxide output decreased dramatically. Right. Europe has done reasonably well, but for the most part, we don't have a regime, an international regime, to deal with a climate problem that is in any sense powerful, that is working, that is doing the job that needs to be done.
And how much time do we have to deal with anthropogenic climate change?
Some people would say it's already too late. I'm not quite in that camp, but we're getting very close. The problem is that at some point you get enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that that warming becomes its own cause, that things start to happen that really override any things that human beings do at that point. So for example, you get major methane releases from melting permafrost. The permafrost melts, methane is released, that reinforces global warming, causes more permafrost to melt, and it's a runaway situation.
Becomes a vicious cycle.
It becomes a vicious cycle, and there are a number of possible processes that could kick in, at which point we're dealing with what's called a threshold effect. We sort of go over a precipice, and the situation is irreversible. Generally, it's considered that 2 degrees Celsius of warming is the point at which you're running a serious risk of that kind of runaway change. It's getting to the point now where it's going to be actually very difficult to avoid a 2 degrees Celsius warming. We have already warmed pretty close to 0.8 degrees, as I mentioned. We have, even if we stop all carbon dioxide emissions right now, another 0.6 degrees in the pipeline. So that's 1.4 degrees already. So that gives us only about 0.6 degrees of leeway. And given the industrialization we're seeing in India and China and the carbon dioxide emissions that industrialization implies, it's difficult to know how we're going to not gobble up at 0.6 degrees and go well beyond.
Now, do you sense that policymakers actually understand this and are simply unwilling to pay the political cost of making the adjustments necessary to combat it? Or do they tend not to understand it or not believe that it's a problem?
Depends what policymakers you talk about and in what communities. On balance, I think most policymakers understand the problem. I think in Europe there's quite an acute understanding and the readiness to accept scientific and technical arguments and accept the advice of scientists is higher. In North America, Canada, and the United States, I think we're seeing a situation where there's reduced receptivity. In the Harper cabinet, is heavily populated by climate skeptics, people who actually deny the science and say the science isn't valid. That's less true in the American administration right now, but Congress, especially the Senate and especially the Republican senators, are very heavily influenced by climate skepticism. But the really big problem here is that even if you get the political elites and the political leaders accepting that there is a problem, there's astonishing resistance from special interests and vested interests, energy companies, hydrocarbon producers, manufacturing industries, unions, all of whom would be hurt by the changes, the economic changes we need to make to solve this problem.
Hurt in the short term, but perhaps devastated in the long term.
That's right.
We'll be back in just a minute with Tad Homer-Dixon talking about climate change. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And I'm back with Tad Homer-Dixon. Welcome back. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about alternatives. Of course, carbon is the big problem. We're running on a carbon-based economy in the world today. What are the alternatives?
We are running on a carbon-based economy. I don't think most people realize just how carbon-intensive our economy is. About 80% of the energy we use in the world comes from carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas mainly. What are the alternatives? Well, it's not easy to find the ones that will do the job. Lots of people talk about solar, wind, which is a kind of solar power because the sun is heating the atmosphere and causing the air to move around, and so you capture that kinetic energy using windmills, for example, or maybe you capture the solar power directly using photovoltaic panels, heating panels or something. The problem with solar is that the power density is low. You can only capture so many watts per square meter. And maybe on average, if you're doing well, you can capture somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 watts per square meter. And often in places where you're not actually consuming the power, because where you're consuming the power is not so sunny, and the places where you generate the power is in a sunny place. So you've got to get the electricity from one place to another.
And there's quite a lot of loss.
And there's a lot of loss in the transmission. That's right, 10, 20% sometimes. And in those places where you're consuming the power, for instance, in the core of a big city, your consumption in terms of watts per square meter might be in the neighborhood of many thousands, up to 5,000 watts per square meter. So there's a kind of spatial mismatch between the power density of production of power with solar and the power density of consumption. And that's a really fundamental problem. It means that solar is going to be useful for some applications, but not for a lot. You're not going to be able to run aluminum smelters or power high rises for the most part with solar power. So we need to find alternatives that have very high power density but are zero carbon. And when you look around, there are actually not very many.
What's your opinion of nuclear?
Well, nuclear is one of them. Although the people who are advocates of nuclear tend to neglect all the carbon that's produced in mining the uranium ore, refining the uranium ore, processing it, turning it into fuel, building the nuclear plant, and then at the other end, decommissioning it and dealing with all the waste, all of which is going to be very carbon intensive because you've got to have transportation and equipment and stuff. But while the plant's running, you actually have fairly low carbon intensity. But the problem with nuclear is that it is enormously capital intensive. And if you look at the plants that are being rolled out right now, for instance, one in Finland that's coming in at 3 times the original cost projections, you have to wonder whether it's actually going to be feasible to build thousands and thousands of these things in the future. Mm-hmm. I do have one suggestion, and I think this is the potential game-changing technology, and that's deep geothermal. So you go really deep, you go 5 to maybe even 10 kilometers underground, and you tap the heat that's coming out of the Earth's core. So instead of building nuclear reactors all over the surface of the planet with all the attendant problems of proliferation and waste disposal and everything, let's drill into the planet and tap the heat that's being produced by the largest nuclear reactor on the planet that happens to be very well contained at the center of the Earth.
Is there a downside to that we know of?
Well, potentially. I mean, people have been doing it, and they've had to, because drilling technologies are not too advanced, because you have to go through very hard rock. They've tended to drill in places where the heat's close to the surface, and those tend to be places that are tectonically active, right, where earthquakes are likely, like Northern California, or there was one test well drilled in Basel, Switzerland, and you get earthquakes. Right. So the trick is we have to learn how to drill deeper in places that are not seismically active, and then we can ship the power from there to the population centers where we need it. But that technology, going deep to generate hot water, pumping water down 10 kilometers, bring it back up to the surface several hundred degrees Celsius, using it to drive turbines. That technology is a potential breakthrough technology that could be available on large scale within a period of a couple of decades in every country in the world.
Now, how do we encourage governments to take alternatives more seriously? They're notoriously bad at encouraging investment in alternative energy sources or funding research and development.
That's right. There's a developing argument out there, and it's getting traction quite quickly, that governments actually have to step in, and that with this very basic research, and we've seen in the past with for instance, the internet, has to be simply subsidized because corporations aren't going to do it. The risks are too high, the payoffs are too long term. So the governments need to recognize that there's a public good needed here in terms of basic knowledge, in this case, for instance, for deep geothermal, developing the new technologies to drill through very hard rock, igneous rock. And in the absence of that investment, we're just not going to be able to put anything on the table fast enough to deal with our climate change problem.
And what happens if we fail? Suppose we blindly proceed down the carbon road with a nod and a wink towards alternative energy sources, but at the end of the day, our economy is still fundamentally tied to oil and to coal.
Well, I mean, that's sort of the route we're on right now, and until the economic crisis and the contraction that resulted, the humankind was above the worst case United Nations estimates of carbon emissions. And that would imply a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 2100 of close to 900 parts per million, so well over triple pre-industrial levels, heading towards quadruple. We've easily got enough carbon fuel, especially coal, to do that if we want to. China's using it, India's using it. And that gets us into a territory where actually the models start to break down. But we're looking at probably temperatures and then increases in the neighborhood of 6, 7, perhaps 10, even 12 degrees Celsius. So people need to keep in mind that the total warming since the coldest period of the last ice age is only 5 degrees Celsius. So this is a monumental change in a period of a century. We would be talking about truly catastrophic damage to global food production, major melting of ice caps and glaciers, very significant sea level rise, inundations of coastlines. Probably we're in a situation there where the planet would not be able to sustain anything approaching the population that we probably will have by 2100, which is supposedly going to be in the neighborhood of around 9 billion people or so. So we are talking in those scenarios about significant population collapse, major violence, a major crisis for humankind.
And are we potentially looking at the extinction of the human race?
I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, human beings are amazingly resilient and robust as individuals and as small communities. We're a bit like rats and cockroaches. We're sort of generalized creatures who manage to adapt to extremely harsh circumstances. But I certainly think that you could see the collapse of modern civilization in the worst case scenarios.
Right. Cheery thought, but we'll be back again with Tad Homer-Dixon after a short break. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back, Tad. You published a widely read, award-winning book titled The Upside of Down. So what is the upside to our failure to grapple with climate change?
That's brought to the conclusion in the book partly by thinking about the climate change problem, but more generally by all of the converging issues and crises that humankind seems to be facing, whether it's an energy crunch or widening gaps between rich and poor people, and asking myself why it is that we just seem to be so bad at addressing a lot of these challenges, and recognizing that frequently human beings just don't address their critical challenges until there's a crisis of some kind. So the down in the title of the book, The Upside of Down, is breakdown or crisis. And the argument is that we should be thinking about how we can capitalize upon or exploit crisis in order to produce positive change. And there's a background sort of social theory, simplistic social theory here, the suggestion that in general we can divide our societies into two categories of people. Most people you could call non-extremists, and then there are other folks you could call extremists, easily identified usually because they are rather intolerant, and don't listen to debate, and think they know exactly what the answers are to all the problems that they're confronting. And in a crisis, usually extremists know what they want to do, and they're well networked, and they're pretty well resourced, and they know who the enemies are, and they're ready to go. And my concern is that in a time of crisis, the rest of us who are non-extremists are going to be wandering around, wringing our hands, saying, oh dear, this is really bad, what are we going to do now? And my suggestion is that we should be thinking about how we can exploit these moments of opportunity, what I call moments of contingency, when things are fluid in a time of crisis, when people are looking for answers, when they're really ready to consider what would have been previously radical alternatives. And have plans ready to go, and maybe even have the political networking and the political mobilization ready to move in those moments of opportunity.
What would these plans look like in the climate change case? What issues do you think we should be thinking about now, reconfiguring our political systems, our economy, the way we interact on a personal scale, on a global scale? What kinds of things would be in a plan?
I think a plan like that, which I've come to refer to as Plan Z or Plan Z, as in the last plan, would have details going all the way from the individual and community level up to the global level. So there would be plans for what people can do in their own households in terms of changing their lifestyles and reducing their carbon output and adapting to climate change. And some of that would have to be done at the community level because the shocks could be quite dramatic. Economic crisis, changes in food production. There might have to be some quite significant adaptation. But really where the planning should start in some respects is at the global and national levels. You're going to have to develop scenarios for what the possible shocks might look like. I think one of the most likely, for instance, is a global food crisis. So how are we going to absorb this shock without catastrophic failure of our societies? If all of a sudden global food production takes a major hit, say 10, 20, or 30%, because major grain-producing regions suddenly are being hit by drought repeatedly, how are we going to respond? Are there buffering stocks put aside? Do we have already research and development underway for crops that are adapted to radically different climates, say much higher temperatures or much drier situations? Who's going to get first access and priority access to food reserves? And what kind of international collaboration and cooperation are we going to have to try to share the resources that are available? These are questions we should be considering now.
Right. Although intuitively you would expect if there were a food crisis of that kind, the countries that produce enough food for themselves
hold on to their
would
own.
Immediately hold.
In fact, what we saw in 2008 was exactly that kind of response. Food prices spiked, they doubled or tripled in some cases, and a whole bunch of countries that were food producers adopted essentially a beggar thy neighbor attitude and stopped exporting food. Right. Now, if we want to make sure we're prepared, we need to actually consider alternative responses beforehand rather than waiting until the crisis hits and then trying to figure out what we're going to do at that point.
And even if we make those plans, is it possible to sell a plan like that to a food producing area when it might actually result in local food shortages?
I think it was going to be difficult. There's no question about it. But that kind of adaptation is only one component of a whole package of things. So I think what you try to do is you sell the whole package. And the other parts of the emergency response will include things like a very rapid ramp down of carbon emissions. So you actually have to do something about the underlying cause instead of just punting it into the future, which is what we're doing now. So how quickly can we ramp down carbon emissions in response to this challenge? And then the third thing that we will probably have to consider as part of this package is some kind of geoengineering, which means intentional intervention in the planet's climate to try to stop the immediate heating effect that we're experiencing. Now, I think if you put the three things together, the adaptation, the mitigation of carbon emissions, and the geoengineering, and you propose those for different packages for different scenarios of climate shock, and then there is some concert in terms of elite understanding of the challenges and what they're going to do under different scenarios, then it's possible it could be sold at the level of individual countries. You got to remember that the alternative is kind of a situation where everybody defects, right, and everybody tries to protect their own interests, and the result is a kind of Mad Max world of all against all, where you have a real disintegration of the prospects for international governance and, as I said before, human civilization, and what we would regard as human civilization. And that, I would hope that alternative would sober people up and make them realize that they actually have to cooperate on these things.
Well, one would think, but are there actually only losers in climate change, or would there potentially be winners?
In the first decades, the coming decades, there may be some winners. In Canada, it's possible will be one of them. Our winters will become less harsh. Food production may increase in certain areas. As you get further out into the century, the models are suggesting that overall, just about everybody's going to lose. Especially on food production, the temperatures rise to a point where you're seeing negative impacts on food production even in temperate zones like Canada. And very significant negative impacts in tropical zones. The negative impacts in tropical zones are beginning now. You can see them now. In the temperate zones, there may be a positive for a while, and then it goes negative. So when you're looking at the lives of our children and grandchildren, certainly, the balance starts to become pretty decisively negative for just about everybody on the planet.
Right. Well, we'll be back with Tad Homer-Dixon in just a minute. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Tad, let's come back to the question of governance. So we've just been talking about the risk of defection. In fact, there's an enormous collective action problem here. What can we do, practically speaking now, to prepare the groundwork for the best possible global governance to help us get through some looming climate shock? What are the basic steps we can be taking now?
Well, some of this is going to be a little bit abstract because I think we're really struggling with answers. I think everybody is really struggling with answers. A lot of the conventional bromides that people would trot out in response to global governance challenges just seem to be failing wholesale when it comes to this problem. We are so far off the mark in relationship to what we should be doing in terms of responding to this challenge, that it's appalling to people in the know. I mean, there's a sense of despair creeping through the communities of climate scientists and negotiators and others. But we do have, as you said, a collective action problem. And there's terrific incentive, and there will remain terrific incentive for individual nations and communities to defect, to try to protect their own interests. But we have to recognize, as I mentioned a moment ago, that everybody will also recognize that down that road is ultimately disaster, that nobody will win in the end. Part of the challenge here, and this is true for any collective action problem, is creating a sense of the commonweal, a common sense of identity across all the actors. I mean, it's usually said that in a collective action problem, what you want is a kind of Hobbesian Leviathan to step in and coerce everybody into cooperating. But actually what we usually do is a combination of sticks and carrots. Sure, you have some coercion, but there's a terrific amount of moral suasion and identity building too. And how we deal with public goods problems and collective action problems in, say, Canada, and in all modern societies, is by creating a sense that, in some sense, it's your responsibility and duty to contribute to the well-being of the whole. Maybe not to contribute enormous amounts, but at least consider it as part of your calculus. And one of the challenges we face today is no common sense of humankind, of humanity. Everybody's pulling in their own directions and still very much rooted in the national identities and their ethnic and religious identities, their civilizational identities, if you want to use Sam Huntington's language. And somehow we need to create a much stronger conception that we're in this together as a species, as a common species-wide sense of community. Now, how might that happen? Well, it's interesting that at the very time when we face perhaps the greatest challenge that humankind has ever faced to its, if not its very existence, to its possibility of prosperity and well-being, we happen to have in place a rudimentary technology for species-wide democracy, and that is the internet. And it's just beginning. Huge swaths of humankind don't have really good access to it yet. But there is something of a conversation going on across the planet that could be harnessed and developed for the development of a sense of identity and a conversation, a species-wide conversation about what we're going to do, that might take place largely independently of the conventional political institutions and national and state apparatuses that are trying to engage with the climate change problem now. So I don't see that we're going to make real progress on this problem until we see hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding that something be done. And I don't see that happening unless people start to mobilize themselves actively through these modern networked forms of communication such as the internet.
But it sounds to me as though what we really need is a large-scale social shift in the direction of altruism and pro-social behavior. And if democracy is the solution, and from one perspective, it might also be the problem from another, because democracy
Absolutely.
Is all about individual choice.
That's right.
Not being told what to do by a nanny state.
That's right. That's right. We do need a shift towards pro-social behavior, but that is only going to emerge through a democratic conversation. Now, it's a big chance, right? You know, we could have that democratic conversation, and the result might be everybody retreats into their own little camps. On the other hand, one of the things that happens in an effectively functioning democracy is the reinforcement of the sense of identity as a member of the larger group and of one's responsibility to the larger group, a sense of citizenship. Well, we need a sense of global citizenship here. Everybody needs to realize that they have a responsibility to the whole, and those who are best off, and fundamentally the climate change problem is a problem of equity on this planet for a whole bunch of reasons. And those who are best off need to realize that they have responsibilities to those who aren't. It's a very small lifeboat now. You know, to use the metaphor, you can't have one end of the lifeboat sinking while the other end floats.
Exactly. But what can, say, Canada be doing as a society, and what can the Canadian government be doing as a government to help nudge us in this direction? We seem to be more problem than solution at this point.
At the moment, our whole policy is a disgrace. It's embarrassing to be Canadian, to be frank, when you go out into the world and talk about these issues with people who are trying to solve the climate change problem. Our national policy has been hijacked by a narrow set of special interests that are largely located in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and to be frank, largely related to the oil sands. And they speak directly into cabinet with this particular federal government. And that's a real problem. And in a very fundamental respect, we've given up our international identity as a middle power, as an honest broker, as somebody who tries to constructively resolve problems like this and create space for the creation of a public good that all humankind can share, which is the kind of thing that Canada has done, for instance, with its peacekeeping activities. And now we're nowhere to be seen. So Canada should return in some respects to that original role. It's still something we can do. Sure, the economic structure of the globe has changed. We're smaller relative to emerging economies than we used to be, but we still have huge influence, and there's a great deal of respect, if not influence, a great deal of respect, residual respect for Canada around the world, and we can play a significant role as a builder of this new sense of global community. Right at the moment, we're not there at all.
But if we did see the light as a society, and if our government saw the light, what are Canada's particular comparative advantages in this conversation? What could we do by example or through argument that would actually make a difference in a larger global conversation?
Well, let's start with our carbon emissions. It's simple as that. And if we're going to start with our carbon emissions, we actually need to do something about the oil sands. So just to bring this back, because we only have a moment at this point, Albertans are very good at poking holes into the ground. Rather than dealing with the decline of their oil and natural gas conventional reserves by digging up the oil sands and dumping huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, let's learn how to drill deep in the earth, really deep, and do deep geothermal in down 8 to 10 kilometers, as I was saying before, and then sell that technology around the world. A zero carbon technology. And Canada could be at the leading edge of new kinds of technologies that the world needs to deal with its climate change problem. Instead, right at the moment, we're bringing up the rear with all of the old conventional technologies that are doing the damage in the first place.
Right. Well, we probably already are on the leading edge to some extent because we're a large mining economy. So we have significant mining technology. As you say, we're very good at digging.
We are well positioned to be at the forefront of this.
Right. Thank you very much, Tad, for coming in and taking the time to talk to us about climate change. This is Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I hope to see you again next week.
1,000 years ago than it is right now. But those arguments, for the most part, just don't have any scientific support.
Is there any one particular skeptical argument that you would say is probably stronger on balance than the other ones? Is it the natural variability argument?
The issue that's really central for most climate scientists is what's called the sensitivity of the climate, how much warming you're going to get from a doubling of pre-industrial concentrations of carbon dioxide from somewhere around 280 parts per million by volume in the atmosphere to 560 ppm. And in general, the sensitivity is assumed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 degrees Celsius. You double to 560, and that gives you, once the climate stabilizes, which may take several centuries, gives you a 3 degrees Celsius warming. That sensitivity is influenced by a lot of factors, and one of the critical things is clouds. How the clouds behave, what kinds of clouds you get, whether they're high in the atmosphere or lower in the atmosphere. And those affect the reflectivity of the atmosphere to incoming solar radiation, the sun's radiation. And there's been a lot of quite legitimate dispute about that. At one extreme, it's possible that clouds actually counteract warming by reflecting. As you get warming, you get more clouds because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that reflects radiation back out into space and so cools the planet to counteract the warming. Another extreme, the clouds can actually trap in infrared radiation and actually accentuate global warming. There's a paper that was released in Science magazine just a week ago that pretty decisively showed that on balance you're getting that reinforcing effect, what's called a positive feedback, and so you're actually getting more warming from clouds rather than less. So I think we're en route to settling that dispute, but that's the only one that I think really carries weight at this point.
Right. Now we've been paying attention to the issue now for a couple of decades. Is it fair to say that we have global governance on climate change at all now? Or?
The evidence is very clear. The scientific evidence is very clear when you look at it in aggregate, add it all up and from the different disciplines and the different research programs. that that warming is taking place, probably somewhere around 0.7 degrees, 0.8 degrees Celsius since the mid 19th century, and that especially in the last 40 years, the warming is human-caused, and almost certainly by release of carbon dioxide in very large quantities. And that buildup of carbon dioxide is changing the characteristics of the atmosphere and trapping in more infrared radiation. Now, the science supporting those statements is pretty well indisputable at this point. You can get into arguments about whether the warming has been caused by sunspots, about whether carbon dioxide is actually the most potent greenhouse gas, whether it was warmer in the medieval warming period.
Today on Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast, we're talking with Tad Homer-Dixon on climate change. Welcome to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Every week we talk to an expert who works on the frontier of global governance. And with me today is Thomas Homer-Dixon, the CIGI Chair of Global Systems at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Tad.
Great to be here.
Nice to have you here. Well, climate change, of course, is something we've all been hearing about for a very long time, and the question remains whether we're taking it seriously enough, partly because there are skeptics. What do you say to climate change skeptics? Or is that still an aspiration?
It's largely aspirational. I mean, we have something that you might call a global conversation about climate change, and there's supposedly a United Nations framework in place, United Nations framework on Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol as part of the UNFCCC process. But overall it's rudimentary. There are very few countries that actually lived up to their terms, and if they have lived up to the terms of the agreement and the commitments they made, industrial countries for the most part, it's more or less by accident. Russia has, but that's because it had an economic collapse, and so its carbon dioxide output decreased dramatically. Right. Europe has done reasonably well, but for the most part, we don't have a regime, an international regime, to deal with a climate problem that is in any sense powerful, that is working, that is doing the job that needs to be done.
And how much time do we